discuss my grading process for you guys so you'll know for the future. What's up?
You skipped me on the roll.
Oh, did I?
Make sure.
Um,
Jaden Lee.
I got you.
Okay.
Or if I didn't say it, I marked it down. You're good. Thank you for saying something though, 'cause just in case. But I mean, one here and there isn't too big a deal. Okay, we are in. Make sure they've got this up because it's probably gonna do it like it usually does. All right. So for the papers, even if the paper you turned in was not 2 to 3 pages and did not have any works cited and did not have any kind of citations, the worst possible grade you can get, unless you don't do at all what I asked you to do, if you turn in something that's completely out of left field, you're still probably going to get a B from me. Sometimes I'll give people like 70s and 75s if it's like really not good, but you still at least turned in a paper. For the most part, I'd go down to 80. If you at least give me a works cited page, that's an 85 to 90. If you make sure you give me citations within the body of the work, like, hey, this information that I'm using, I got from this source. So you're not just like putting down information and not telling me where you got it from, because that's technically plagiarism, but I'm not going that far. Just for future reference. That'll get you 90, 95. And if you actually use quotations within your work and make sure you cite them, then that'll knock you up to a 95 and 100, because I like seeing quotations in your work. That for future reference is, because the second paper I'm going to grade a little bit harder. Not much harder, mind you. But if you want to aim for those really higher A's, make sure you do the citations, you throw in some quotes here and there. Make sure you have a works cited page, because if you just give me a paper without any citations, any works cited, and you're like, oh, this is just something I pulled out of my ass, I'm not going to be quite as kind the second time. You're still not going to fail in my class for that. That's just how not how I roll for papers. But you're definitely not going to get a B the second go around. But yeah, if you're wondering about the grades you got, that's how I do it. If the paper's fine, if it's decently written, you're at least going to get a B. If you make sure you put in the work, the citations, the work cited at least, that's going to be a high A probably, or a high B, probably at least an A, a 90, 95. And if you put in quotations, which is not necessary, but is well liked in a historical paper, that'll knock you up to a real good A. So any questions? Okay, if you want to see your paper, I've got them here. Like I said, you can pick them up on the way out if you want to. The grade is on the last page, so I've just got them laid out with your name showing here, and you can just grab them as you go. What's up?
Do you have any markings or anything?
I had a bunch to do, so not a whole lot. If you have specific questions, you're welcome to ask. There were a few that I had to put some markings on, but those are like people putting like the year 1900, and it's like, this is clearly a typo, right? I don't think anybody in this class did that. And there was one particularly rough paper where it was like, the natives and the Europeans were friendly to each other. It was like, what? I don't think and I don't think that was this class either, but it was questionable. But no, again, it's mostly the contents of the content of the papers overall were fine, but for like the specific last couple of points to get to the high A was like the citations and the putting in quotes from your sources. Otherwise, you guys did fine. Yeah, but if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask me after class. Because, like I said, they're all right here. But let's do any other questions before we do everything else? Okay, let's get the study guide done so you guys can be ready for Wednesday. And we'll do that. So, and like I said, I will make sure to get this test graded quicker than I did the papers. The papers are always kind of a slog for me, as one can imagine. Okay, so we ended with fighting in the West, George Rogers Clark, General John Sullivan, etc. In particular, where are we at? The Spanish helping in along the Mississippi River Valley and around St. Louis. Major General John Sullivan, who was well known for murdering natives. Okay. So, the British were not just stuck in New York. They did have contingents in the South. I mean, obviously, we had the large section in Virginia. Captured Savannah in 1778, took control of Georgia. General Clinton had to head north and left Savannah in control left Lord Charles Cornwallis in charge of Savannah. He moved north and took Charleston in 1780. The South had a lot of loyalists, so it wasn't quite the even fight that it was up in the north. Bannister Tarleton was known for slaughtering civilians and surrender patriots. So we had our own war crimes guy in return, Thomas Sumter, who led a group of patriots to slaughter loyalist civilians. So, yay, war crimes on both sides. Thomas Sumter is one of the historical characters that Mel Gibson's character was based on in the movie The Patriot, if you're familiar with that movie, which I was like in middle school when that one came out, so Lord knows if you guys have seen that. General Gates attempted to aid colonial forces in the South, but was defeated by Cornwallis and Camden around the same time that they discovered General Benedict Arnold's betrayal. The book doesn't really go into much detail with what happened with Benedict Arnold. We mentioned that he was pretty much the leader of what was going on with Saratoga. However, he was overlooked for a lot of important positions and ended up with basically a garrison job at a fort in Albany. And he felt like he was being, I wouldn't say mistreated, but he wasn't being treated with the respect that he deserved. And I would argue that that was at least half true. But also, the woman he was involved with was a loyalist and got him in contact with loyalist forces, and they were like, hey, if you come to the British side, we can help you out as long as you help us out. And long story short, he turned the fort over to the British, which it was a fairly important fort, and it did cause some trouble, but the biggest issue with Benedict Arnold switching sides was the morale blow that it caused, because so many of the big generals, including Washington, saw him as like this close confidant and friend, and the fact that he would turn was completely shocking. So moving on from that, Continental forces routed Major Patrick Ferguson's troops at Kings Mountain. Again, if you've been to the upstate here in South Carolina, you should recognize some of these places. General Nathaniel Greene replaced Gates from the south, used tactics of Daniel Morgan and Francis Marion. Again, Francis Marion, obviously a pretty famous fellow down here, used guerrilla warfare to harass the British troops because, as usual, he did not have the numbers to just engage them in open warfare. So he would just come out of the woods, hit the British, and then disappear back into the woods. There was a Patriot victory at Cowpens, and technically the British were victorious at Guilford Courthouse. However, the British suffered enormous losses, causing them to retreat back to Yorktown, Virginia. So, again, if you're familiar with my European history class, which I think all of you are new, so you shouldn't be, this was a Pyrrhic victory. This was we technically won, but we lost so many guys that another victory like this, and we're going to lose the war. A victory that you can't exactly capitalize on because you've lost so many dudes, you got to get the hell out. So Guilford Courthouse, and then they got out, went back to Virginia, and awaited reinforcements. And if you've been paying attention to this semester so far, this chapter so far, the British waiting for reinforcements has not gone well for them. So here they are taking Charleston. You can tell because it's in a swamp. Here's Tarleton preparing for some war crimes. Here's, I believe that's supposed to be Francis Marion doing some war crimes. Not Francis Marion, Sumter. Here we have the Colonials getting their butts kicked. Looks like the British are losing this one. This was Cowpens. As you can see, the Colonials definitely have the advantage. And yes, I know, again, standing in a line and shooting seems like a bad idea, but the smoothbore muskets they had were not, at all accurate. You had to get a bunch of dudes to stand in a line and all shoot the same direction to hope to hit somebody. Meanwhile, at Guilford Courthouse, the British won that one technically, but they lost a lot of dudes in the process. And by a technical victory, I mean the Patriots retreated from the battlefield before the British did, but the British were about ready to leave around the same time. So it's like, hey, we won. We don't have hardly anybody left. So, all right. So that was the South. Yorktown, the final major battle of the war. Whoops. Largely Washington working with French allies. Count de Rochambeau, moving south from Rhode Island. General Lafayette pushing from the shore. Again, Lafayette about as important as Washington in terms of this major general who was doing very important work in the war itself. So thanks Lafayette. He'll be important in a later war though not necessarily for us. French naval vessels kept the British from shipping supplies from the West Indies because, again, we didn't have a navy. And by October 19th, Cornwallis surrendered because Clinton's reinforcements never showed up because, again, we had a lot of troops, including the French, who were keeping the rest of the British occupied. Now, technically, bless you, technically the war ended with this surrender. But, well, okay, I shouldn't say technically. Realistically, the war ended with this surrender. But technically, it didn't end for another 2 years because the treaty wasn't ratified or prepared or whatever until 83. That's why we say the war went from 77 to 83. So British colonial soldiers continued to skirmish over territory. There was some back and forth, but no real, major battles. June of 83, troops were discharged without back pay. We almost had a mutiny. 300 men marched to Philadelphia. Washington showed up with his troops and managed to talk them down. This is something we're going to see happening again after World War I, and General MacArthur doesn't talk them down. He just fires on veterans. Good work, General MacArthur. So the Treaty of Paris was finally signed on September 2nd of 1783. That's the official end of the war. And the reason it took so long was because the French didn't respect us. They opposed American Republican principles and did not consider the delegates as political equals. Now, while that is insulting, sure, that's exactly how America immediately starts treating other independence movements around its sphere of influence as soon as America becomes big enough for that to be a thing. Like Cuba's War for Independence, which we'll see next semester, Panama's War of Independence. Basically, every small nation in Central and South America that has its War of Independence, we get involved in. And I mean, hell, even Mexico has a revolution, and we basically start a small war with them over who they put in charge. We get it just as involved in other people's stuff as France was involved in ours, and if not more, actually significantly more. So anyway, the new borders that the borders that this new country, America, now had, everything south of Canada until Florida, and then west to the Mississippi River, so basically what the colonies originally were, but now without that proclamation line. Spain got Florida back due to their aid in the war, because they were also technically there. I'm going to give France a lot more credit because they did a lot more in the war, but Spain was there, and Spain did help. They did a lot in the Caribbean. They did a lot around the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. But as far as the major battles that we talk about, Yorktown and all of that, that was mostly the French. But Spain was there. Spain got Florida back. So there's Yorktown. Yorktown was never fully taken, but there was enough pressure put on it that they did surrender. But you can see here the American and the French forces pushing in, gradually overwhelming the British defenses until they realized they're not getting any reinforcements. There's a mutiny in Philadelphia. I like that dude. He's got 2 single-shot musket pistols. It's like, look, I can only shoot 2 of you, but I will shoot 2 of you. Don't know what happened to this guy. He might have got, looks like he might have got stabbed. So here's the new United States. We've still got disputed territories. I think Spain ends up giving that to the U.S. Obviously, we're going to have issues with the British, but we'll talk about that later. So, we won. We defeated one of the most powerful militaries in the world, and everybody was surprised, especially the Americans. So there were a number of reasons for this victory. It wasn't just because we had a better military, and that was definitely not a reason. We did not have a better military. We did have some advantages. For example, our leaders had fought in a 7 Years' War not that long before, and the battlefields they were fighting on were typically the same battlefields they fought on in the previous war. So it was like, hey, we've done this before, so we're familiar with where we're fighting. The British were fighting across the Atlantic Ocean, far from supplies or command. Again, they were either getting their supplies from the West Indies, which the French and Spanish quickly began to blockade, or Canada, which, again, was one of the first targets of the Patriots pushing back. Also, their outside assistance had a big part in this. The British had Hessian mercenaries, native allies, and freed blacks, all of whom had their own goals outside of keeping the British Empire whole. None of them really cared about that. The Hessian mercenaries were there for their pay. The native allies were there to keep their own land. They didn't really care about the British. And obviously the freed blacks were there for their freedom. And if the British were going to retreat, they were going to retreat with them. They weren't fighting for the British. They were fighting for themselves. And if the British were going to offer freedom regardless of winning or losing, that's all well and good. You know, if it's slavery or fighting for the British, sure, we'll fight for the British. It's not if we win, you get to be free. It's if you fight for us. Like, all right, sure. And especially once things started going poorly, you know, you're not fighting to your last breath if there's a way out. Meanwhile, the Spanish and the French on the side of the Americans had been used to fighting the British. I mean, again, the French have been fighting the British since 1066. The Spanish nearly as long. And when it came to their goals, they had things beyond North America that would be beneficial to them if they won this particular war. So it wasn't just, oh, if we win this war, we'll be able to take things in North America, because like we saw, Spain got Florida, and technically the French didn't really get anything in North America. Now overseas, they actually got quite a bit. They also got a lot of debt, which is going to lead to some issues for them later. We'll talk about that in future chapters. But yeah, there was global ramifications to this. Also, when it came to a British victory, the British were going to have to conquer the colonies one by one, because while we've been talking about like this colonial unity and blah, 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 if the British had taken Philadelphia, which they ended up doing, and captured the Continental Congress, which they didn't, that wouldn't have ended the war. A lot of the colonies didn't care what the Continental Congress was doing. They were just fighting for their own independence. So, you know, if they took over, say, Massachusetts entirely, Rhode Island didn't care. you have to defeat the militia of Rhode Island, and Connecticut didn't care. You'd have to defeat the militia of Connecticut, etc. You have to move all the way south. So it wasn't like with how the Americans won, where they had Cornwallis surrender, and so the British overall surrendered. If they had defeated Washington, it'd have been a bad blow, but that would have been everybody. And also, just the citizens in general were pissed, so they were going to still have to deal with militia, which is just poorly trained dudes with guns. And I mean, it's America, so it's just going to get worse. So yeah. A lot of popular histories, even contemporary British reports, claim that the Declaration of Independence was the start of the Revolution. As we've seen, there were steps from like 2 chapters ago leading up to this point, at least pushing for some level of independence, if not outright revolution. But that said, there was not a feverish drive for independence. The final steps towards declaration was reluctant, even with the Battle of Bunker Hill. A lot of the soldiers that fought in the army wanted to return to private life, but the government couldn't provide pay, and that's going to be like a major part of the next chapter. We'll get to that in a bit. So, major financial issues for the government. Farmers and natives come into conflict. The government couldn't help them. And finally, just a quick note on Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams all working abroad, particularly in France and Britain. After this point. So they weren't content to stay in the U.S. and just hang out. They were busy overseas, creating alliances, creating diplomatic relations. Because, I mean, if we're going to be a new country, we've got to have, proper political ties. Especially with France, but England too. It's like immediately after this, we become trade partners with England. Okay. So, let's move on to the study guide. Let me make sure I can get this to work properly. Duplicate. Hey, it worked. I can see forever. Right. I don't know why say this every time. I don't know why the resolution's so weird. Okay. So, on to study guide. Actually, let's do it from here. And actually, I've got the... I have the key. Where's the key? Oh, is the key still in the book? It is. Awesome. Yoink. All right. Let's do it. So starting with religious and social upheavals, Puritan ministers. Who was the Puritan minister who complained about the mercantile elites in Boston, from their wealth to their fashion sense? How dare they be wealthy and not wear rags? Puritan minister who complained about everything.
What chapter was it?
Chapter 4. Complain about.
Samuel?
Yeah, what's his last name?
Swiller?
Sewell.
Oh, Swiller.
Sewell. All right. By comparison to Sewell, who was a Puritan minister who tried to meld Puritan ideals with real-world desires, even going as far as to support the smallpox inoculation. So it's another Puritan minister who was a little more moderate. Wanted his son to be a proper gentleman and supported the smallpox inoculation.
What was the question?
The Puritan minister who melded Puritan ideals with real-world desires, also, yeah, Cotton Mather. All right, those were the main boys there. How did Puritans believe they could detect the presence of Satan? Like, what were some ways they believed Satan acted in the world? Yeah, natural events. That's an N, please. Thank you. Goodness sake. Yeah, I mean, just as God worked through nature, so could Satan. And usually it was, like you said, disasters, malformed babies or animals, that sort of thing. All right, on to Salem. There's going to be a lot for that. So, what was the name of the slave from the West Indies whose fortune frightened Salem into a witch hunting frenzy in 1692? The Reverend's slave who scared the children, and they're like, oh, there's witches, and then everybody freaked out. Just try. Tituba. Or Tituba. I don't know exactly the pronunciation there. And I almost gave this one away because I was going to mention his name. Name of the Reverend in Salem who first dealt with the outbreak of witchcraft hysteria. And he was the one who owned Tituba.
William Phillips.
Not Phipps, he was a different guy. This is the Reverend. Paris, Samuel Paris. Oop. 2 R's. By May, Massachusetts colony. Bleh. By May, Massachusetts colony got a new governor. What was his name? Yes, that was Phipps. All right. So, with Phipps presiding, what Puritan leader was appointed to the special court to oversee the Salem trials? I'll give you a hint. We've seen this guy before. Yeah, Sewell again. It's fun doing multiple choice and just being able to copy and paste the answers later in the test. All right, one more for Salem. What was the term for evidence used in which trials gathered through dreams or visions, which was later dismissed in the Salem trials? Yeah, spectral evidence. I'm gonna say I know some people in some of my classes are gonna know this for sure because I saw it a bunch in the papers. Okay. All right. That will do it for Salem. Let's go ahead and pull this up like that. All right. Now, the patriarchy. What's a term for the English concept of the unity of husband and wife, where the wife was politically, socially, and legally covered / hidden behind her husband? It's the direct translation of covered / hidden behind. Yeah, femme covert. Or couvert, I don't know, it's probably, yeah. The T is probably silent because if it's Old English, it's half French. It doesn't matter. I don't know why I'm bothering with the pronunciation. It's multiple choice. It's not like this is an oral test and you guys have to tell me what it is and I'm going to get you for pronunciation. That'd be terrible. No, I'm not. That's not how I roll. Anyway, so with the patriarchal order, with men's and women's jobs being separate, how did that apply in reality to farms? Like, did women do farm work?
No.
Did they do farm work? They did. Now, they still had to focus on a lot of domestic work on the farms. But, I mean, if you're out there, like, dealing with the chickens and milking the cows and working in the garden, that's farm work. So, women still did farm work. Like, the farm work was still separated by, gender, but they still did farm work. Okay? Bless you. If a couple, if a couple wanted a divorce, who did they usually have to appeal to? Yes, but specifically, like within these smaller towns or cities. And government is correct, but city council. But who ran the city council? Church leaders. Don't worry, this will make sense when you get the test. In any kind of domestic dispute, who usually ended up with majority of the power? I was going to say this one's, the power, because obviously it's the 1700s. Okay. So there were land disputes with natives. We're really only going to talk about one at the moment. The name of the purchase that used a forged treaty to gain more land after William Penn's death. Whoops.
Breach of contract?
What's that?
Breach of contract?
No, that was just what they did. No, this is the name of the treaty that used a forged document to get more land after William Penn died. So this is specifically within Pennsylvania. And it's a type of purchase, cough, cough, in the name. Yeah, the walking purchase. Because it was how much land could be walked off in a day and a half. It's a surveyor thing. I had a student that was like a apprentice surveyor. That's apparently still a thing. Okay. All right, Great Awakening. Here's a lot. There's a lot. So, from the start, we had the two groups that had opposing views. So, one of the groups wished for all Protestant churches to work together to face the crisis of diversity. Yeah, New Light Clergy is, I don't know. I've never heard of that before I did these notes. I'm like, hey, this sounds like something I could put on the test. So, by comparison, what group wanted to remain in the old ways and stick to established traditional norms? Old Light Clergy. That's easy. All right. What was the name of the intellectual movement which the Great Awakening was partially a response to? It was the intellectual movement mostly in Europe, but the founding fathers were still a major part of it.
What was the question?
The intellectual movement which the Great Awakening was partially a response to. The Enlightenment. All right. The group of German Protestants, make sure I'm not skipping. Yeah, group of German Protestants push for people to follow their heart rather than their head in spiritual matters, and this idea spread throughout the colonies. I really don't know. Probably pietist. Because it seems like it comes from the word pious, but I don't know. Pietist. That's the group of German Protestants who really, I don't know, I've never seen like that group around anymore today. And kind of off the back of that, what was one of the colleges in the colonies at the time of the Great Awakening which used learned discourse rather than passion to teach new ministers? This is one of the big colleges in the colonies at the time.
Harvard.
Harvard. Literally Harvard. Does anyone remember the other one?
College of William and Mary.
Yep. Yeah, the first one's easy because it's literally Harvard. College of William and Mary, it's still around. It's still pretty big, but it's not like, Yale or whatever. Okay. Who was the minister? He used networks of communication to travel quickly. Sorry. He used networks of communication and travel to quickly spread his word, rapidly spreading the ideas of the Great Awakening. It's the only minister we're going to talk about because his name isn't hard to say. George Whitefield. He also had that terrible satirical cartoon made of him where his eyes were crossed. All right. One more for Great Awakening, and then we'll move on. This one's also kind of hard to ask. So, was the Great Awakening did the Great Awakening create unity or disunity within the congregations of the colonies? Because remember what actually started the Great Awakening between the Old Light and New Light clergy? There's like dissatisfaction with the established ways, the established norms. So did it result in unity or disunity? Right. I mean, it still overall resulted in a revitalization of religion, but it did cause more like splitting of congregations. Caused unity. I mean, you can see that even today, just like you go down any street, especially here in South Carolina, and you pass like 12 different churches, and they're all slightly different denominations. Even like the 3 or 4 different Baptist churches are all going to be slightly different from one another. I mean, that's neither good nor bad. That's just how things are. Because we've had like another Great Awakening since this one. All right. Let's move on to the second chapter. Well, I guess technically the 5th chapter. So before we even get into the 7 Years' War, because I can call it whatever I want to call it, what was the term for forced recruitment, typically into the British Royal Navies, that often resulted in citywide protests? Impressment. Specifically into navies, yes. Okay. Once again, I got ahead of myself. What war against France increased the tensions in the North American colonies against British rulership? So what big war against the French? 7 Years' War. This is multiple choice. There is no French and Indian War option. I'm pedantic. You have to deal with it. Who was a British politician who turned things around in North America during said war? We named a city after him because he helped us capture a major fort. William Pitt. That's how we got Pittsburgh. For better or worse. And limit set by proclamation line. Okay, wow, we're done with this one. Where did the proclamation line of 1763 set the western limit of settlement? How far west were settlers allowed to, settle due to the proclamation line? Like what geographic boundary? I was about to say the Rockies are way the other way. Yes. Don't worry, Rocky Mountains are not an option. Okay. Yes, the Appalachian Mountains. Which are apparently like some of the oldest mountains in the world. But I don't need to get into that. We'll never finish. Okay. That's that. All right. There's lots of acts of parliament to raise money after the war. And I know, and yes, this is a little bit annoying because there's a bunch of acts, but I'll try to do my best to help you remember why each one's called what they are. So, the first major act passed by Parliament, 1764, meant to raise money in the colonies, was specifically meant to stop smuggling in the Caribbean. So it has to do with ships. Also, smuggling and like trade, so both have to do with like ships. The Navigation Acts. Is it Acts or Acts? I got Act on the test, so. Navigation Act. When I think navigation, I usually think naval stuff. So colonists didn't appreciate it. Parliament responded with another act that put a tax on all legal documents, so paper stuff. Stamp Act. See, that one's easier. Now this one, a little bit harder, but I'll give you my reasoning after somebody answers it. This is another act of Parliament in '67. Taxed goods like glass, paper, and tea. So it's three separate things. It's actually not named after a thing, it's named after a person. Yeah, Townshend Acts. This one is the only one that is plural. Townshend Acts, because it's multiple things. So, keep that in mind. Okay, let's quickly go to this. The college responded unpleasantly. Tensions arose in the colonies, coming to a head in Boston. Was named the violent clash between protesters and British soldiers in Boston in the winter of 1770. The violent clash between, the Bostonians and the soldiers. Now, the way I've got it written, it kind of implies that this is a response to the Boston Massacre, and it really wasn't, because this happened years later. Anyway, after more taxes and stuff, the colonists set out to destroy British property, in particular 45 tons of tea being tossed into the harbor. What was this called? Boston Tea Party. I was expecting more than one person to answer that. They destroyed tea in the harbor. That's one we should all remember. In fact, several people wrote about that. Okay. So after this unrest and violence in Boston, Britain closed the port of Boston, revoked its charter, set up a quartering act, These were collectively known as the coercive acts in Britain. What did the rebellious colonists call them? The intolerable acts. Because they would not tolerate them. I mean, I guess they sort of had to, but yeah. All right, and let's have one person before we move to the final chapter. Where is he at? The former politician and head of the Sons of Liberty was leading opposition to the British in Boston. Yes, Samuel Adams. My brain did not hear that correctly. I heard Abraham Lincoln. I was like, wait, what? Yeah, my brain was not. And then it processed it. I was like, no, that was Samuel Adams. You said Samuel Adams. Why did I hear Abraham Lincoln? Okay, yeah. It was me. It was not you. Okay. Cool. On to the thing. Where were the first shots of the American War of Independence fired? Lexington. Whoopsie. Was the name of militiamen who formed across the colonies, especially Massachusetts, who could be prepared rapidly to counter any British aggression? The Minutemen. It's in the name. Was it? Did they do what they say on the tin? All right. The first major battle of the war was where? I wouldn't consider Lexington and Concord the major battle. Yeah, Bunker Hill. It's famously just called Bunker Hill. We can just say that. I'm still kind of pedantic about Breeds Hill because it was still there, but as far as the test, we'll just use Bunker Hill. But yeah, it was Bunker Hill. And please get this, you guys. Who was chosen to lead the Continental Army following the first proper battle of the war? Thank you. Jeez, if I could spell it. All right. So, on to the next one. And I am actually done with the short answer on that, so that's good. Yeah, obviously George Washington's the short answer. I hope you guys can deal with that. Who wrote Common Sense? Thomas Paine. Let's see. Another one I've got to figure out how to ask. Was the push for independence popular across the colonies? Like, was it universally accepted by everybody in the colonies? No. Movement for independence was not. Yeah, it depended on your socioeconomic standing and your political stance, and there was a lot of differences for where you were geographically, where you were politically, where you were economically. So yeah, it was a very dangerous time. Okay, social contract. Who expressed the social contract theory in regards to the call for independence? Another important fellow. John Locke. Obviously, he wasn't around for this, but his ideas were. All right, what was the turning point battle of the war? Was seen as the turning point battle of the war. That it can be argued, but we're going to use this one. Saratoga. If I can scroll. Who commanded the Battle of Saratoga? I told you, very important general. No, that was the British. Gates was there, but he wasn't the senior general. Yeah, Benedict Arnold. Remember, I told you, he wasn't just the dude that switched sides. He was very important before then, which is why his betrayal was such a big deal. What country officially joined the war for independence following this turning point battle? France. Which again, was a huge deal. All right, we're almost done, I promise. All right. Aid for the sides. We got the German mercenaries. What were they called? Specifically, the German mercenaries that Washington and his men routed near Trenton, New Jersey. Also, the Headless Horseman was one of these German mercenaries that apparently lost his head to a cannonball. Yes, say it louder. Hessians. We talked about a lot of the women who fought for the Patriots, but this one I want to use for the test. Name of the Patriot woman who disguised herself as a man and fought as a soldier against the British. I didn't mention this in the notes for some reason, but she did eventually get herself a captain's commission, which, again, is pretty freaking rad. She was the last one in that list of women we talked about. Yes, Deborah Sampson. And a couple of questions about slavery before the final bit. Which sides did the slaves tend to support more frequently? British. We've it's obvious. This one I don't really have anywhere to put, so I'm just going to throw it here at the end. What was the first state to officially abolish slavery in their state constitution? Vermont, right. Okay, we're almost there. Where did the final major battle of the War for Independence take place? Just talked about it. Where was the last big battle? Where Cornwallis surrendered? We literally named a ship after it. Yorktown. I've been to that ship so many times when I was little that I thought that it was the ship, not an actual place. I was confused. What did Britain get out of the war? Like, what land did they get out of the war? Maybe I should rephrase it. What land did they get to keep? Think of the map. Where were the British at after the war? Or even today, what is currently part of the British, if you're familiar at all with the British Commonwealth? Yes, nobody's familiar with the British Commonwealth. Canada. The British got to keep Canada, and for a lot of the British politicians, that was kind of a win. The Canada had a lot of natural resources. Okay, who regained the control of Florida thanks to their somewhat late entry into the war? The Spanish got Florida back. Couple more questions and we're done. What was the name of the treaty which finally ended the war in the colonies? This is a treaty we're going to see like 100 more times because they keep going to the same city and signing treaties. That's not a city. It's a palace outside of the city. Paris. Treaty of Paris. Versailles is also a common one, but that's just the palace. Versailles didn't exist yet. How far west did the new United States stretch? So once again, what is the western natural border of the United States at this point? We don't have that proclamation line anymore. Mississippi River. That's not peace. What did what did I miss? All right, Mississippi River. And then there's, of course, extra credit, but that's on you. All right. That's it. I'll see y'all on Wednesday.